year was 1902, and the village of Holloway lay quiet beneath a pale, misty sky. The air held a chill, though it was not winter, and the heavy clouds seemed to press down on the thatched roofs and narrow, cobblestone lanes. That morning, the townspeople walked in silence, their footsteps echoing as they made their way toward the churchyard. They came not for celebration, nor for the ringing of wedding bells, but for the funeral of a man whose life had touched nearly every family in Holloway. Edward Hargrave, the schoolmaster. Edward had been more than a teacher. For 20 years, he had guided the children of Holloway with strict discipline tempered by deep compassion. He was a man who believed education was not merely the memorization of facts, but the shaping of character. Many of the town's blacksmiths, shopkeepers, farmers, and clerks had once sat at his wooden desks, bent over slates, listening to his steady voice. Some remembered the sting of his cane, others the warmth of his praise, but all agreed on one thing: Edward Hargrave had been a pillar of their community. When news of his sudden death spread, it struck Holloway like a cold wind. Only a fortnight earlier, Edward had been seen walking through the village square, hat in hand, pausing to greet neighbors. He had looked tired, yes, and he had spoken of feeling unwell, but no one expected the illness to claim him so swiftly. The doctor had named it pneumonia, worsened by a weak constitution. The explanation seemed reasonable, and yet to many, the loss felt too sharp, too sudden, too cruel. The church bells tolled as the villagers gathered. The mourners came in their best garments, though most were patched and worn. Men wore stiff collars, black armbands, and polished boots. Women carried lace, trimmed handkerchiefs, and shawls to shield them from the damp air. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, their wide eyes reflecting both curiosity and sorrow. They had lost not just a teacher but a guide, a man who had scolded them one moment and praised them the next, a man whose very presence seemed to demand respect. At the front of the procession walked Margaret Hargrave, Edward's widow. She was pale and composed, though her eyes were rimmed red from many sleepless nights. She carried herself with dignity, refusing to collapse into the arms of others. In one hand, she clutched a small prayer book, its pages worn from years of use. Beside her walked her brother, offering silent support. Behind them followed Edward's students, past and present, carrying small bunches of flowers. Wild violets, daisies, and rosemary sprigs gathered from the hedgerows. Their youthful hands trembled as they placed the blossoms on the coffin, which rested atop the horse-drawn hearse. The coffin itself was modest, crafted of dark oak and polished until it gleamed. Upon it lay a single wreath of white lilies, chosen by Margaret for their purity. The villagers fell silent as the hearse passed, each bowing their heads in respect. Some whispered prayers, others remembered private conversations with Edward, moments when his wisdom had steadied them. Inside the church, the atmosphere was heavy with grief. Candles flickered against the stained glass windows, casting colored light on the stone floor. The vicar spoke with a trembling voice of Edward's service to the community, his devotion to learning, and his unwavering faith, a man of principle. He called him a friend to all who sought truth. His words stirred the crowd, and sniffles echoed in the pews. Even the strongest men found their eyes watering as they remembered Edward's stern yet kind presence in their youth. But funerals are not only for remembering the dead, they also reveal much about the living. Among the mourners, faces told different stories. Some were etched with genuine grief, others with quiet contemplation. Neighbors who had quarreled with Edward years ago now regretted harsh words spoken in haste. Former students remembered both punishments and lessons with a new tenderness. Even those who had envied Edward's respectability now stood humbled by his passing. It was during the hymn, however, that something unusual occurred. As the congregation sang, their voices trembling but steady, the photographer, Mr. Alcott, discreetly positioned his large camera near the back of the church. In those days, funeral photographs were not uncommon. They served as solemn records for future generations, reminders of both loss and dignity. Most of the villagers thought little of it as Mr. Alcott adjusted his lens and prepared the exposure. One by one, he captured the images, the coffin, the widow, the mourners gathered around in their sorrow. And yet, in one of those frames, Fate would capture something no human eye had noticed in the moment, a man's expression not of grief, but of concealed satisfaction. That photograph would later speak when words failed, but for now it remained a silent secret locked away in the film's emulsion. As the funeral drew to a close, the coffin was carried to the graveyard, where the earth awaited. The gravediggers lowered it carefully, ropes creaking under the weight. Margaret stood at the edge, clutching her handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She whispered a final farewell as clods of earth began to fall, the dull thuds echoing like a heartbeat. The villagers lingered, some offering words of comfort, others simply standing in respectful silence. When the last mourner had gone, the grave lay covered with flowers, their colors soft against the dark soil. Holloway seemed quieter than ever, as though the village itself mourned the absence of its schoolmaster. Yet beneath the stillness, beneath the grief, something unseen stirred, a question unasked, a truth not yet uncovered. Edward Hargrave was gone, but his death was not what it seemed. The funeral had ended, but the story was only beginning. When the funeral of Edward Hargrave had passed, the villagers of Holloway returned to their daily lives, carrying the weight of his absence with them. The grief was still raw, but the routines of farming, shopkeeping, and housework pressed forward. Life, as always, continued. Yet, in one small shop tucked at the edge of the square, a truth waited silently to be discovered. That shop belonged to Mr. Alcott, the village photographer. Known for his patient manner and steady hands, he was trusted to preserve the most important moments in people's lives. Weddings, christenings, family portraits, and, on rare occasions, funerals. His camera was a bulky contraption with brass fittings and a black cloth draped at the back. Few in Holloway understood the workings of such a machine, but all respected its ability to freeze time. After Edward Hargrave's funeral, Alcott had taken several photographs. He had captured the coffin carried by solemn men, the widow with her downcast eyes, and the congregation gathered in rows of black garments. It was a tradition of the era, a way for families to remember their loved ones in their final moments, to create a permanent testimony to grief and dignity. Several days later, in the dim light of his workshop, Alcott began the process of developing the glass plates. He mixed his chemicals with care, the familiar smells of developer and fixer filling the air. One by one, the images emerged in the trays, ghostly at first, then sharp and defined. The funeral unfolded again before him, silent yet vivid. But as his eyes lingered over one particular plate, a strange unease settled over him. At first, he thought his tired mind was playing tricks. Yet the longer he looked, the more it disturbed him. Among the mourners standing close to the coffin, there was a man whose expression seemed at odds with the scene. Where every other face carried sorrow, tears, or solemn stillness, this man's lips curved ever so slightly, not into grief, but into something unsettlingly close to a smile. Alcott leaned closer, adjusting his spectacles. Could it be a flaw in the plate, a trick of shadow and light? He examined the negative again, then the print, holding it at different angles. No, it was no accident of chemistry. The expression was deliberate, faint but unmistakable. In the midst of mourning, this man had worn the look of quiet satisfaction. The photographer's heart quickened. He knew the man's face. Thomas Blythe, a fellow schoolteacher at Holloway, younger than Edward and often seen at his side. Alcott recalled moments when Thomas had seemed restless during Edward's speeches at town gatherings, his jaw tight with envy. But such feelings were common among men. They rarely amounted to more than idle jealousy. Still, in that photograph, Thomas's expression told another story. Alcott sat back in his chair, wrestling with unease. Should he say anything? It was dangerous to accuse a man based on an expression caught in a single moment. People might laugh at him, dismissing it as foolish superstition. And yet, the photograph seemed to burn with unspoken truth. It was as if the camera, an impartial witness, had captured something no eye in the church had noticed. Days passed, and the thought would not leave him. He showed the image to his wife, who gasped softly when she noticed the same unsettling detail. "It's wrong," she whispered. "Everyone else looks as they should, but he looks as though he hides something." Still, they told no one else. Rumors could destroy lives. and Holloway was a place where whispers spread like wildfire. Yet fate would not allow the photograph to remain hidden. One afternoon, Margaret Hargrave visited Alcott's shop. Dressed in her widow's black, she had come to collect the photographs of the funeral, a painful task she faced with quiet dignity. Alcott hesitated before handing them over. He considered slipping the troubling image aside, but honesty tugged at him. Slowly he laid all the prints before her. Margaret studied them in silence, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the edges. When her eyes fell upon the photograph in question, she froze. Her breath caught, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. Then, in a voice low and steady, she asked, "Do you see it too?" Alcott nodded. "I did not wish to trouble you, madam, but it is there, plain as day, and I cannot explain it away." Margaret's gaze hardened. She knew the face well. Thomas Blythe had worked beside her husband at the school for years, always courteous, but always carrying an edge of resentment. Edward had once confided in her that Thomas coveted his position and often sought to undermine him. She had dismissed it then as professional rivalry, the kind of tension that arose between ambitious men. But now, looking at the faint, almost triumphant smile in the photograph, a chilling thought took root in her mind. The photograph had not spoken words, yet it revealed what no one else had noticed. It was as though the camera had stripped away the mask Thomas wore, exposing a glimpse of his true heart in that moment of solemnity. Margaret's doubts about her husband's sudden death, which she had pushed aside in the fog of grief, now returned with force. She thanked Alcott quietly and left with the photographs tucked beneath her arm. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, and the village seemed to carry on as usual. Children laughing in the lanes, women carrying baskets, men mending fences. But inside Margaret's heart, a storm was brewing. The image she carried was more than a keepsake of loss. It was a silent testimony, a piece of evidence too strange to ignore. That night, as she sat alone by the dim light of a lamp, she laid the photograph on the table before her. Edward's coffin stood at the center of the frame, the mourners gathered in sorrow around it. Yet her eyes fixed only on Thomas, his faint smile like a shadow on the truth. She whispered to herself, "The dead may rest, but the photograph does not lie." It was the beginning of her resolve. Grief had silenced her once, but the photograph had given her something more powerful than sorrow. It had given her the seed of suspicion and the courage to seek answers. The days after Edward Hargrave's funeral blurred together for Margaret, his widow. The house they had shared for 20 years now echoed with silence, every corner a reminder of his absence. His desk still held the papers he had been marking the night before he fell ill. His coat hung neatly by the door, as though he might step inside at any moment to claim it. To the villagers of Holloway, Edward's death was a tragedy that must be accepted. To Margaret, it was a wound that refused to close. Grief is a strange companion. It dulls the senses one moment and sharpens them the next. Margaret found herself noticing small details she might once have overlooked. Her husband's teacup still resting on the shelf, the faint stains at its rim, the strange bitterness he had often complained about in his final weeks. He had brushed it aside, thinking it was a change in the tea leaves, but Margaret remembered the unease in his voice. Now, those memories pressed upon her with new weight, especially after seeing the photograph. The image haunted her, Thomas Blythe, her husband's colleague, standing among the mourners with a trace of something that should not have been there. A shadow of triumph where there should have been grief. Margaret had never liked Thomas. Outwardly, he was polite, even charming at times, but she had often caught the flicker of resentment in his eyes when Edward spoke of his work or received praise from the community. Edward was a natural leader, admired for his discipline and fairness. Thomas, though capable, lacked the same respect. He lived in Edward's shadow, and shadows can fester bitterness. Still, Margaret had never imagined malice strong enough to take a life. Even now, she wondered if her grief made her see what was not there. Could the smile in the photograph have been an accident of the camera? Could her memories of Edward's complaints be no more than the fragile threads of a widow's mind, weaving meaning where none existed? Yet the doubts would not leave her. She recalled clearly how Edward had changed in his final weeks. His once strong frame grew weak. He had spoken of sharp stomach pains, and on more than one occasion he had clutched his abdomen after sipping his tea. Margaret had begged him to see a doctor sooner, but Edward, ever stoic, had delayed until it was too late. The physician had named pneumonia as the cause of death, but pneumonia did not explain the bitterness, the cramps, the wasting away. Margaret began to watch Thomas more closely in her mind, replaying memories of his visits. She remembered how often he lingered near Edward's desk at the schoolhouse, how he insisted on brewing tea when Edward worked late, how his compliments carried a sharp edge of insincerity. She remembered, too, Edward's words not long before he died. Thomas covets what he cannot earn. He wants respect, Margaret, but he does not know how to win it. It was easy enough to dismiss envy as harmless, but now, in the light of the photograph, those words seemed like a warning. Still, Margaret was a woman of 1902, living in a world where women were often expected to endure quietly. To accuse a man of murder based on a widow's suspicion and a photograph would seem absurd to most. She feared ridicule, the wagging tongues of the village, the stern dismissal of the authorities. And yet, she could not silence the gnawing inside her. Her husband had trusted her with his doubts. Was it not her duty to seek the truth? At night, when the village slept, Margaret sat by the fire with the photograph laid out on the table before her. She studied it again and again, her candlelight flickering over Thomas's faint smile. Each time, her resolve grew stronger. It was not merely her imagination. There was something there, something too deliberate to ignore. The camera had no reason to lie. One evening, she invited her brother, William, to the house. He was a stern man, practical to a fault, and not one given to superstition. When she showed him the photograph, he frowned and studied it silently. At last, he said, "A smile in a moment of grief is peculiar, yes, but peculiar does not make a murderer." Margaret's voice trembled, but she pressed on. "And what of Edward's illness? You saw how he wasted away. You heard him speak of the bitterness in his tea." William shifted uneasily. "Many illnesses strike without warning. To suspect a man without proof is dangerous, Margaret. Holloway is not kind to those who stir trouble." But Margaret's doubts were no longer whispers, they were roots, growing deeper each day. She knew she risked her reputation, perhaps even her safety, yet she also knew that silence would mean betraying Edward's memory. If Thomas had indeed poisoned her husband, then he had stood smugly at the funeral, hidden in plain sight, confident his crime would go unnoticed. That thought filled Margaret not only with sorrow but with quiet fury. Her doubts, once fragile, hardened into determination. She resolved to speak to the constable, not with accusations but with questions. She would tell him of Edward's complaints, of the bitterness, of the photograph that unsettled her so deeply. She expected resistance, perhaps even mockery, but she could no longer carry the burden of silence. For Margaret, the photograph had become more than a piece of paper. It was a silent ally, a fragment of truth in a world of uncertainty. And though she was only one woman, her quiet doubts had begun to transform into courage. She whispered to herself as she tucked the photograph back into its envelope, "If no one else will speak for Edward, then I must. Doubt is no weakness. It is the beginning of truth." And so, in the dim light of her lonely home, Margaret's mourning shifted into something stronger. Her doubts had given her a purpose. What began as grief would now become a quest for justice. Margaret Hargrave had never been a woman who sought the spotlight. Like most women in Holloway, her days had been filled with household tasks, small kindnesses for neighbors, and supporting her husband in his work. She was respected for her gentleness and admired for her loyalty, but she was not known for boldness. Yet grief has a way of reshaping the human spirit. It can crush the will, or it can forge a quiet flame of resolve. For Margaret, grief became the latter. For weeks after Edward's funeral, she wrestled with her doubts in silence. She told herself she might be mistaken, that perhaps she had misread the signs of his illness, or that the expression in the photograph was no more than a trick of the lens. But the more she tried to silence those thoughts, the louder they became. It was not only suspicion that drove her. It was the memory of Edward himself. She had promised to stand by him, in sickness and in health, and though death had parted them, she felt her duty remained. Still, the question loomed: how could she, a widow with little influence, dare to speak of murder in a world that expected her silence? The Holloway constable, Mr. Barrett, was a stern man with a reputation for practicality. He handled thefts, drunken brawls, and disputes over land, but a case of suspected poisoning, that was something else entirely. Margaret feared he would dismiss her, perhaps even scold her for slandering a fellow schoolmaster. Yet, each night as she studied the photograph by lamplight, she grew more certain that she must risk it. On a grey morning in early March, Margaret dressed in her plainest black gown and walked to the constable's office. She clutched the envelope with the photograph so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath her shoes. "Mrs. Hargrave," Barrett greeted, rising politely from his chair. His tone was formal but softened by pity. "What brings you here today? Is there trouble?" Margaret drew a deep breath. "I fear there is, Mr. Barrett. Trouble that began before my husband's death and has not yet ended." She laid the photograph on his desk, her hands trembling only slightly. Barrett studied the image with a frown. "This is from the funeral, yes. What am I to see here?" Margaret pointed to Thomas Blythe, his faint smile preserved forever in the photograph. "Do you see it, Constable? Every mourner bowed in grief, yet he looks as though he had reason to be glad." Barrett shifted uncomfortably. "A smile, madam, is not a crime. People wear strange expressions when grief unsettles them. It does not prove wickedness." Margaret held her ground. "No, it does not prove it. But it raises a question. And I have more than a question, sir. Before Edward died, he spoke often of a bitterness in his tea. He grew weak, his stomach pained him, and yet the doctor called it pneumonia. I tell you, it was no pneumonia. I believe my husband was poisoned." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Barrett leaned back, folding his arms. "Poison, you say? That is a grave accusation." "I know it is grave," Margaret replied steadily, though her pulse raced. "But I also know my husband. He was strong, and though he coughed, it was not his lungs that failed him. It was his strength. And I know Thomas Blythe, constable. He coveted Edward's position, envied his respect. He brewed his tea often at the schoolhouse. You may dismiss me as a grieving widow, but I cannot ignore what I know." Barrett was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the photograph. At last he sighed. "You are brave to come forward, Mrs. Hargrave. Many would have remained silent. I cannot act on suspicions alone, but I will not turn a blind eye. If there is truth in your words, evidence must be found." For the first time since Edward's death, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. She had spoken, and she had been heard, not laughed at, not scolded, but taken seriously. The constable promised to make quiet inquiries, to examine the schoolhouse, and to consult a chemist if he found cause. It was not yet justice, but it was a beginning. When Margaret left the office, the sky seemed lighter, though the clouds remained. She walked through the square with her head held higher than before. Some villagers looked at her curiously, but she did not care. She had broken through the wall of silence that grief and fear had built around her. That evening, she sat by the fire, reflecting on what she had done. It would have been easier to remain silent, to accept the doctor's words and let Edward's death pass into history as an unfortunate illness. But easy paths rarely lead to truth. She thought of the children Edward had taught, the men and women he had guided. He had always told them to stand firm in the face of wrong, to speak truth even when it cost them. "Character," he would say, "is forged not in comfort, but in courage." Those words echoed in Margaret's heart now. By speaking up, she honored Edward more than by weeping silently. She had taken the first step toward uncovering the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Her courage did not erase her grief, but it gave her a new strength. She realized courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear. And so, though her voice had trembled in the constable's office, she knew she had done what was right. In the weeks to come, Margaret's courage would prove vital. The investigation would move slowly, and she would face doubt, even whispers of gossip. But she had learned that the truth often begins with a single brave word, spoken by someone who refuses to remain silent. For Margaret, that courage was born not from ambition or pride, but from love, the enduring love for her husband, and the conviction that his death must not go unanswered. Investigations in small villages rarely move quickly, and in 1902, the wheels of justice turned slower still. Constable Barrett was not a man prone to rash action. He had listened carefully to Margaret Hargrave's suspicions, weighed the troubling photograph in his mind, and decided to proceed with caution. A careless accusation could ruin reputations forever. A false step could turn neighbor against neighbor. If the truth was to be uncovered, it would have to be done with patience, persistence, and discretion. The first step was the schoolhouse. Barrett made his visit quietly, carrying the air of routine inspection. He walked through the wooden hallways where Edward had once taught, the desks neatly aligned as though still awaiting pupils. Behind Edward's old desk, tucked away on a high shelf, he found a teacup Edward's, marked with the faint stain of use. Many would have overlooked it, but Barrett remembered Margaret's words, bitterness in the tea, pains in the stomach. He carefully collected the cup and brought it to the town chemist, Mr. Rawlins. Rawlins was a meticulous man, skilled in the handling of powders and tinctures. Days later, his report confirmed what Margaret had suspected. The cup bore traces of arsenic, a poison bitter in taste and deadly in effect. It was a substance found in pest control, not uncommon in rural England, but far from harmless in human hands. The discovery did not prove who had delivered the poison, but it shifted the case from speculation to certainty. Edward Hargrave had not died of pneumonia. He had been poisoned. Barrett, though cautious, could not ignore this. He began asking questions quietly, speaking to villagers one by one. Many recalled how often Thomas Bleeth had lingered near Edward's desk, offering to brew his tea when long hours of marking kept him late at school. Some remembered seeing him leave small parcels of powder in the cupboard, explaining that they were tonics or herbal remedies. A few even admitted that Thomas had spoken with bitterness about Edward, muttering that some men are praised for what others do better. But hearsay was not enough. Barrett needed something more solid. For weeks he observed Thomas discreetly, noting his movements, his conversations, his unease whenever Edward's name was spoken. At times, Barrett felt frustrated by the slow progress, but patience became his ally. Truth, like a seed, needed time to take root and grow strong enough to withstand doubt. Meanwhile, Margaret bore the strain with remarkable strength. She faced the village daily, enduring whispers of pity and speculation. Some neighbors dismissed her suspicions as grief-stricken delusion. Others quietly admired her courage but feared to speak openly. Yet Margaret did not falter. She trusted that patience would bring justice. Just as Edward had always taught his students that diligence brought knowledge. She prayed each night not only for strength, but for the truth to be revealed in its fullness. At last, Barrett's patience bore fruit. One evening, he returned to the schoolhouse under the pretense of inspecting the building. In Thomas's desk drawer, he found a small tin, its lid smudged with powder. Inside was a substance that, when tested, proved identical to the arsenic found on Edward's teacup. This discovery, coupled with the testimonies of villagers, built a case too strong to ignore. The arrest of Thomas Bleeth shook Holloway to its core. The man who had stood at Edward's funeral with a faint, unsettling smile was led through the square in irons, his face pale, his composure shattered. Some villagers gasped, others muttered prayers. Children who had once feared his sharp tongue now stared in silent confusion. For many, it was unthinkable that a man of learning, a teacher, could commit such a crime. The trial that followed was long and wearying, but truth, once uncovered, refused to be buried again. Witness after witness spoke of Thomas's envy, his sharp words against Edward, his frequent presence near the schoolmaster's tea. The chemist's testimony sealed the matter. The arsenic was no accident, no misfortune, it was deliberate. Margaret sat through every session of the trial, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm though her heart pounded. She did not rejoice in the downfall of Thomas. Instead, she grieved anew, not only for Edward but for the corruption of a man who had allowed envy to grow into malice. Yet she knew that justice, however painful, was necessary. In the end, the verdict was clear. Thomas Blythe was found guilty of murder and sentenced to face the consequences of his crime. The case became known far beyond Holloway, whispered about in nearby towns as the funeral photograph murder. The strange detail of the photograph, the faint smile that had first stirred Margaret's doubts, became a symbol of how truth can hide in plain sight, waiting for the patient and the brave to uncover it. For Margaret, the outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served, yet it could not restore Edward's life or their years together. Still, she found comfort in knowing that she had honored his memory not by silence but by persistence. Her patience, matched with courage, had turned doubt into proof and grief into action. The people of Holloway learned a lasting lesson. They spoke often of the case, not only as a tale of crime, but as a reminder that evil can disguise itself in ordinary places, and that truth requires patience to be seen. They admired Margaret's quiet strength and Constable Barrett's steady diligence. In their hearts, they knew justice had prevailed not because of rash suspicion, but because of patience, persistence, and the courage to trust what seemed, at first, unbelievable. And so Edward Hargrave's story did not end with his grave. His legacy lived on in the values his wife embodied: vigilance, courage, and above all, patience. For in the slow unfolding of truth, justice had been revealed, and the light of integrity had shone against the shadow of envy. When the trial ended and the gavel struck its final blow, the village of Holloway seemed to breathe again. The weight of suspicion, whispers, and unease that had hung over the community for months began to lift. Justice had been served. Thomas Blythe was found guilty of poisoning Edward Hargrave. Yet the aftermath was not filled with triumph or celebration. It was quieter, heavier. The townspeople carried with them not only the sorrow of Edward's death, but also the unsettling knowledge that envy, malice, and betrayal had lived so near, disguised in the face of a neighbor. For Margaret Hargrave, widow of the slain schoolmaster, the conclusion of the case was not an ending but a new beginning. She stood at her husband's grave, the earth settled and the flowers blooming once more, and reflected on what the ordeal had taught her. She had been a woman expected to mourn silently, to accept the official word of doctors and men in authority. Yet her refusal to let doubt be buried had changed the course of events. Her quiet persistence had transformed suspicion into truth and grief into justice. The people of Holloway began to see her not only as Edward's widow, but as a figure of strength. She had shown them that vigilance, the willingness to notice what others overlook, and the courage to act upon it, could change lives. She had stood against fear, against ridicule, against the natural urge to remain silent in the face of authority, and in doing so, she left behind a legacy greater than even Edward's years of teaching. The story of the funeral photograph murder spread far beyond Holloway. Newspapers in nearby towns printed accounts of the strange case, how a widow's doubts and a single unsettling photograph had led to the unmasking of a murderer. Readers were struck not only by the crime but by the perseverance that uncovered it. It became a tale told at hearths and gatherings, a reminder that truth is often hidden in plain sight, waiting for those with eyes to see and courage to pursue it. For the children Edward once taught, the lesson lingered longer than any written on their slates. They had lost a teacher, but through Margaret's example, they gained something perhaps more lasting, an understanding that integrity requires vigilance, and that justice often demands strength from ordinary people. When they grew older, they carried that lesson into their own lives, telling their children and grandchildren about the schoolmaster who was poisoned and the widow who refused to let his death be forgotten. Margaret herself lived quietly after the trial, never seeking praise or recognition. She did not consider herself a heroine. To her, she had simply done what was necessary, what Edward would have wanted. Yet her strength resonated. Neighbors came to her for advice, seeking her steady counsel in times of doubt. When disputes arose in the village, people often asked, "What would Mrs. Hargrave think?" For they trusted her honesty and her fairness. Constable Barrett, too, carried the lesson of patience and persistence forward. He often told younger officers, "Do not rush to dismiss a quiet voice. Sometimes the truth is whispered, not shouted." His work thereafter bore the mark of careful attention and respect for those who dared to speak when others would not. The photograph itself, once a simple record of mourning, became a relic of significance. Margaret kept it, not as a token of pain, but as a reminder of vigilance. She would sometimes show it to trusted friends or visiting relatives, pointing not only to the faint smile of the murderer, but also to the solemn faces of the community. This, she would say, is what grief looked like in Holloway. But it also shows us how truth hides among us, waiting to be seen. In time, the story of the photograph grew almost symbolic. To some, it was a warning about envy, that corrosive force that can twist ambition into hatred. To others, it was a reminder that evil is rarely cloaked in darkness alone. It often stands among us in daylight, wearing the mask of respectability. And to many, it was an enduring call to remain watchful, to trust one's instincts when something feels wrong. Margaret's strength gave courage to other women in Holloway. They spoke more freely, challenged dismissive words more often, and carried themselves with the knowledge that even those expected to remain silent could shape justice. Margaret had shown them that strength did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered persistently until it was heard. Years later, when Margaret herself passed away, the villagers spoke of her as a woman of rare courage. They laid her to rest beside Edward, and some whispered that their reunion, long delayed, was now complete. Yet her legacy did not rest in the ground. It lived on in the lessons the village carried: to watch carefully, to question bravely, and to act with strength even when afraid. The tale of Edward Hargrave and his widow's courage outlived the generation that witnessed it. It became part of Holloway's history, retold with reverence whenever villagers gathered to remember the past. Parents reminded their children, "Do not let envy grow within you, for it destroys not only others but yourself. And when you see something wrong, even if your voice trembles, speak it, for silence can bury truth." And so, from grief and betrayal arose a legacy not of despair, but of vigilance and strength. Edward's life had been devoted to teaching, but in the end, it was Margaret who taught the village its most enduring lesson: that the truth may hide, but with patience, courage, and vigilance, it will always find the light.